and Ronald Reagan comes in number 1. What am I going to do with people, man? He got 19%. Lincoln came in number 2 behind the Kipper, and then, the list continued. Bill Clinton came in number 3 with 13%. Look, Bill Clinton is not the 3rd best president we've ever had. Not even close. How about George frickin' Washington? How about Thomas Jefferson? The guy does the Louisiana Purchase, buys a third of the country from the French for a nickel and a dime. And the guy wrote the Declaration of Independence. I know that wasn't when he was president. Louisiana Purchase, when he was president. Okay? How about James Madison? How about FDR, who saves us from the Depression and World War II? How about Truman with the Marshall Plan?
Ronald Reagan. No, I haven't lost my mind. This is President's Week. According to this new Gallup poll this week, 19% of respondents chose Reagan as our nation's number 1 chief executive. The former B-movie star even beat out Abraham Lincoln, the guy who freed the slaves and saved our union during America's darkest days.
Dramatically, the cause of freedom and peace. Mr. Gorbachev, open this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
To ignore the facts of history and the aggressive impulses of an evil empire, to simply call the arms race a giant misunderstanding, and thereby remove yourself from the struggle between right and wrong and good and evil.
Just to set up why I've been so impressed with The Invisible Bridge, I'm sadly old enough to remember the fall of Nixon and the rise of Reagan, although I was a kid, but to some of us that's like the fall of Dr. Doom and the rise of Galactus or something. But
okay, like they're in 3rd grade and Susie says something funny, right? And the Hill reports that they rolled their eyes and they laughed, and Isla joked about it like the taxes would be lower than Reagan. What a ridiculous proposition. Except for the fact that, of course, they are. For most of Reagan's presidency, taxes were above 35% for the top marginal tax rate. They were at 50%, for example, in 1984 when President Reagan got reelected. At one point, they dropped to 28% for the highest bracket in 1986, but for 6 years, it was actually much higher than the 35% we have now. So that's 6 out of the 8 Reagan years. But you think that's bad? Wait till you get the real taxes that people pay. The effective tax rate under Reagan was an annual average of 18.2% of GDP. You know what it is today? 14.8%. Much lower. Under the whole 8 years of Reagan, it was much higher, okay? So President Obama is entirely right, and the Republicans, being the fools that they are like, oh, he's got facts, facts. No, of course not. Reagan is a god. He had the lowest taxes ever. We don't care about no stinking facts. Well, how do you argue with people who do not care about numbers or facts or math?
Reagan inherited a federal budget of $599 billion in revenue, $678 billion in spending, and a deficit of $79 billion. He left with a federal budget of $909 billion in revenue, $1.1 trillion in spending, and a deficit of $155 billion. Ronald Reagan increased the size of government, both in terms of revenues and spending, by way more than just adjusting for inflation, and increased the deficit, the yearly deficit.
If Ronald Reagan was a union buster, he was anti-union, and now he's being honored by the Labor Department. I think what pisses me off most with stories like this is just how dishonest the Republicans are. Because it's one thing if you make the argument, and many Republicans do, many elite Republicans, to be clear. They say, okay, so Ronald Reagan was anti-union, but that's a good thing. I like that. I like when Reagan's anti-union because I'm an elitist myself and I make a lot of money, and I would rather be able to hire and fire workers more at will and not have to deal with collective bargaining and negotiations, and it's a pain in the ass when you deal with them, and I think they're unreasonable, and yada, yada, yada. So if you're honest about your beliefs, like, oh, I like Ronald Reagan because he's anti-union and I'm anti-union, Okay, that's fine. I disagree with you, but at least you're being honest and straightforward. This is just dishonest. Like, oh, we're going to honor him. The Labor Department is going to honor him. Alongside people like fucking Eugene Debs and Cesar Chavez, and act like, oh yeah, Reagan was great for unions. He was in one at one point. Yeah, before he fucking destroyed them and cracked down on them and did the opposite of pro-worker policies. So it's just, you're lying. You're lying. You're acting like, he's good for a group of people that he wasn't good for.
Want to talk about it.
Okay, so let me ask you this. Okay, so you think that the best time, one of the other best times for the American middle class was the Reagan years, when we saw post 1981, we saw a complete shifting of the wealth in America, where the top 1%, and at the time we didn't regard them as the top 1%, right? That, granted, that's a new jargon that we're going with now, but we saw where the middle class began to get squeezed out. There is a share of wealth in America. Yes, you can create new wealth, but as wealth is created, how that wealth is distributed and how that wealth is spread out among...
Something was Reaganomics, specifically changes in our antitrust laws and our tax code that opened the way for corporate predators like Bain Capital. Bain Capital's business model would have been a crime in the 1970s.
Played the role of the useful idiot by dropping the top marginal tax rate below 50%, by reducing corporate taxes, by changing our trade laws, and changing the rules governing CEO compensation.
To prevent the crash of 2016, we would have to make the fundamental changes that we're going to have to make afterward. You would have to start enforcing the Sherman Trust Act again. You would have which says that right now, it was passed in the 1880s, and it says that basically any company that gets so large that they dominate an industry is illegal. And not only the company gets broken up, but people in the company can go to jail in the Sherman Act. And Reagan, in his second year of his presidency, stopped enforcement of it functionally, and no president since then has made a serious effort. The last one was Jimmy Carter breaking up AT&T. So now we have not just the media, but every significant industry in the United States controlled by 2, 3, 4, 5 at the most companies. This is, when you look at biological systems, broad and diverse is strong. Top-heavy and narrow is fragile. So our economy is insanely fragile in that regard. So bring back the enforcement of the Sherman Act, thus break.
It's going to be paid for. I mean, all of these Republicans, all they do is do exactly what started under Ronald Reagan, and that is, they say, trickle-down economics. Everybody benefits. The fact of the matter is, nothing ever trickles down.
And Obama was handed a massive shortfall because of the 2008 collapse, also brought on by tax cuts for the rich from George W. Bush. Wow, what a coincidence. So he brought the deficit all the way down, and as he was bringing it down, now Trump is going to bring it back up. Clinton brought the deficit down, Bush skyrocketed it back up. Reagan, skyrocketing deficits. They never, ever cared about balanced budgets or deficits. It was a lie all along. Now, the last Republican president is to have left office with a balanced budget? Dwight Eisenhower.
I mean, this is like saying, oh, hey, Ronald Reagan, so pro-black. No, but he wasn't. It's not what he was. At least be honest about what you believe.
It makes me crazy when I hear Hillary Clinton use the term dog whistle, that this is dog whistle talk. This isn't dog whistle talk. There's nothing different about the racism that was launched in Philadelphia, Mississippi, back when Ronald Reagan was running for president, and what we're seeing now. We have to admit the obvious. It is the brand of republicanism.
Back when Reagan gave that speech, and not enough people know about it, I mean, he went down and launched his campaign, as you said, from Philadelphia, Mississippi, where civil rights workers were killed. And he didn't give that speech lamenting their death. He gave that speech there as a wink and a nod to the people down there, like, it's all okay. He did not mention them. And that was a very, very curious place to launch your campaign, to give that speech. See, that was a dog whistle. For anyone who wanted to hear it, they knew why he was in Philadelphia, Mississippi. They knew why he didn't talk about the civil rights workers and why it was wrong to kill them. They knew all that, right? But for the rest of the country, sitting in California or New York, you might have no idea why he was down in Mississippi.
Yeah.
Right?
today than we saw when Reagan launched his presidency in Philadelphia, Mississippi, based on hate, based on racism, based on religious division. That was what that was all about. And you know what? The Republicans can say all they want. This is something new. This is not anything new. This is the brand of the Republican Party, and it's been like that since Ronald Reagan made his trip to Philadelphia, Mississippi. And Lee Atwater said the best way for us Republicans to get elected is by hate, by division of religion, and by race issues. And you know,
Philadelphia, Mississippi is where Cheney, Schwimmer, and Goodman were murdered, the three civil rights workers back in the 60s that turned into the movie Mississippi Burning, and it was just so going there is a hugely symbolic thing for white racists and, well, for everybody, I guess. He chose the event and the area for his first campaign speech because it was a great way to shout out to the racists. The Neshoba County Fair is nearby Philadelphia, Mississippi, where civil rights advocates James Cheney, Andrew Goodman, and Michael Schwimmer were lynched and murdered in 1964. They were shot to death by racists who were enraged by the idea of African Americans having not only equal rights, but the right to vote. During his presidency, Reagan openly opposed the Voting Rights Act of 1965. He said the Voting Rights Act was humiliating to the South. Right. In the years since Reagan took office and the Reagan Revolution has swept across America, Americans have lost their faith in the notion that everybody has a voice in the American democracy. To keep corporations in check and to prevent them from stealing millions from the working class. Thanks to Reagan, corporate theft and illegal behaviors have skyrocketed because he did away with government oversight and regulation of corporate America. Reagan's policies led to one of the greatest financial scandals in American history, the S&L debacle, which cost taxpayers billions of dollars and set the stage for weakening bank regulations like we have today. And if people like Senator Phil Gramm, following Reagan's philosophy, hadn't done away with regulation and oversight of America's big banks back in '99 and 2000, the financial scandals that have taken place over the last decade probably never would have happened. Meanwhile, as Reagan was helping out corporate America, he was waging an all-out war on average working people in labor unions in the United States. His attacks on organized labor in America and his attacks on the National Labor Relations Board drove down employee wages. His all-out assault on labor and his staunch opposition against the minimum wage helped contribute to three decades of flat wages, while CEO and executive pay went through the roof. Largely thanks to his failed theory of trickle-down economics, one that's been debunked over and over and over again. And since Reagan was so obsessed with this notion, he didn't do anything to reduce the levels of poverty or the growing income gap in America. But a strong economy and government oversight of corporate America aren't the only things America has lost since Reagan stepped foot inside the White House. America has lost, perhaps most importantly, our trust in government, and we continue to struggle to get it back. After all, the Reagan administration was one of the most corrupt in American history. It included, by one estimate, 31 Reagan-era convictions, including 14 convictions in the Iran-Contra affair, 16 in the Department of Housing and Urban Development scandal. David Simon and Stanley Eitzen write in Elite Deviants, 138 appointees of the Reagan administration either resigned under an ethical cloud or were indicted criminally. Reagan's "government isn't the solution, it's the problem" mantra, which is essentially saying America is bad, continues to cause record levels of distrust and dislike among Americans in our government.
He ran from Beirut. You remember what happened there? There's bombings in 1983. 299 American and French servicemen killed by the Islamic Jihad. 241 American servicemen killed, 220 Marines. That was the largest death toll for Marines since Iwo Jima in World War II. And what did Reagan do? Did he crush the Islamic Jihad? Did he stay in Lebanon and win that war? No, he ran. He ran for the hills. Now, you might agree with that policy. Hey, it was foolish of him to bring those troops in there in the first place. And you might say, hey, it's better that he avoided a longer and more protracted war. That's a fair point. But saying that he's some sort of awesome being who crushes all of his enemies. He ran. It's not in dispute. He ran. He's like, oh, Islamic Jihad. Ah! He ran for the hills. That's who Ronald Reagan is. Furthermore, you know what he did? He traded arms for hostages. You know what that means? He dealt with Iran. He dealt with terrorists, and he gave them weapons. Not only could Ronald Reagan not win in a Republican primary today, he'd be laughed out of it. He couldn't possibly win in a Democratic primary because they'd say, this guy, he negotiates with terrorists. That's what he did in his time as president. Are you kidding me with the love for Ronald Reagan?
To Reaganite values. I'm guessing that by Reaganite values, he means sending the economy into a downward spiral by using the brain-dead policy of trickle-down economics. Well, that's already been done. Or maybe he means we should sell weapons to Contras in the places of the world that hate us in order to protect our interests, even though doing so will probably put us in danger.
That Reagan would have no prayer. I think I've convinced a lot of people that he has no prayer in a current Republican primary. Amnesty for illegal immigrants, raised taxes 11 times in favor of background checks, gun control, negotiated with terrorists, ran from Lebanon, arms for hostages. It's inconceivable. He would be laughed out of the room. But I actually think he would be laughed out of the room in a Democratic primary.
Lincoln wouldn't have been a Republican today. Hell, Ronald Reagan probably couldn't even pass for a Republican today, and he was horrible. But he did throw some bankers in jail, and that goes against everything the Republicans stand for today.
I think Ronald Reagan would be unelectable today, even as a Democrat. Now let's review the record. Reagan gave amnesty to millions of illegal immigrants. Instantly, he's eliminated. That's far too liberal a position for a so-called mainstream Democrat today. It wasn't pathway to citizenship, it was blanket amnesty. I'm not sure there's an elected Democrat in the country right now that argues for that liberal a position. As Reagan once said, facts are stubborn things. Second, he negotiated with terrorists and traded arms for hostages. Another instant elimination. Imagine what Fox News would do to a Democratic president who flat out made a deal with terrorists and gave them arms. Game over, unelectable. Facts are stubborn things. Ronald Reagan, after initially cutting taxes, raised taxes 11 different times. He saw that the deficit was going to be even more out of control and changed course on tax rates. If Obama raised taxes 11 different times on his watch, that's all anyone would talk about. He wouldn't dare, and you know it. Even after Reagan cut taxes in 1981, and everyone gave him credit for being so conservative, the top marginal tax rate at the time was 50%. That's 15 points higher than now. If Obama suggested we had a top marginal rate of 50%, he would be pummeled. Facts are stubborn things. Finally, what happened when we were attacked by terrorists in the Middle East under Reagan's watch? He ran for the hills. We lost 241 U.S. servicemen in Lebanon after a massive terrorist strike by Hezbollah on our Marines. What was Reagan's response? Cut and run. If a Democrat had done that, it is inconceivable that he could get elected in this day and age. He'd be called a coward, an appeaser, scared of terrorists, etc.
Resume. What's next? The Tea Party today has vaulted Ronald Reagan up to be an American demigod. And what's their main party platform? The national debt. So let's see how Ronald Reagan addressed our nation's debt. When Reagan moved into the White House in 1980, and he inherited a $930 billion national debt. When he left office in '88, our national debt was nearly $3 trillion. Let me repeat that. He inherited a debt of under $1 trillion and turned it into a debt of nearly $3 trillion. He added 3 times more debt to the country than all of the presidents of the 21st century combined. He borrowed more money than every president from George Washington to Jimmy Carter combined. And anybody who wants to tell you how the economy improved and things got better after Reagan's union busting and tax cuts for the rich, here's a simple reply. You give me a credit card with $2 trillion on it that my grandchildren will have to pay off, but I don't spend much of anything on, and let me spend that money around on lavish and idiotic projects like Star Wars, and I'll show you what it looks like to live large. Republicans attack Obama for borrow and spend stimulus. Reagan was the ultimate borrower and spender. the largest in the history of the United States of America until George W. Bush came along and borrowed and spent nearly twice as much in the process of resurrecting Reaganomics. So let's add that to Reagan's resume. America's greatest debtor and squanderer of our wealth. Let's see. Who is America's so-called greatest enemy today? Did you say Osama bin Laden? Well, Ronald Reagan helped create him. In order to fight a proxy war against the Soviet Union, Reagan spent billions of dollars training and arming Islamic fundamentalists in the mountains of Afghanistan. Once the Soviets left the country, Reagan allowed those same Islamic fundamentalists to take control of the Afghan parliament, giving the Taliban and Osama bin Laden power that they would one day use to attack America. So let's add terrorist enabler to his resume. Oh, and for those of you who said that America's greatest enemy is not bin Laden, but instead Iran, guess what? He illegally gave weapons to Iran, too. Just look at the Iran-Contra affair. So let's add illegal arms dealer to his resume. Then in 1982, Ronald Reagan signed a bill that gave amnesty. That's right, amnesty. The whole thing, the whole enchilada, amnesty to 3 million illegal immigrants in the United States. I think every Republican in the state of Arizona's head just exploded as I said that. But it's true. So if you want to blame anyone for the huge number of illegal immigrants who thought, hey, more opportunity by coming to this country, just look to Ronald Reagan, America's greatest president. So let's add illegal immigrant coyote to his resume, too. Now, what do we get? Well, let's see, habitual tax raiser, added nearly $3 million to the national debt, terrorist enabler, president who helped our enemies, a president who illegally smuggled weapons to a hostile government in Iran, and a president who exploded our nation's immigration problem. Why is he the greatest president then?
Well, I really liked and knew a little bit Ronald Reagan, and I really liked him.
My childhood was Ronald Reagan. He made us believe in our country again, and he provided the kind of leadership that was necessary to get the American idea back on track.
I turned 18 in 1980, and my first vote was for Ronald Reagan. Boy, am I glad I did it.
The ghost of Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan would make love to me harder than he would make love to Rand. Oh man, Ronald Reagan, if he was here, he'd be whispering sweet nothings into my ear. In fact, he is, and that's why I keep talking about him and telling you what he would do. So now there's an old game in the Republican Party. We've seen this in primary after primary. So this storied tradition continues now. First, Rand Paul.
I'm a great believer in Ronald Reagan. I'm a great believer in a strong national defense. In fact, what Ronald Reagan said in about one sentence sums up really a lot of what I believe. He said to our potential adversaries, he said, don't mistake our reluctance for war for a lack of resolve. People knew that with Ronald Reagan. They still need to know that with the United States. And part of the problem is I think this president hasn't projected enough strength and hasn't shown a priority to the national defense.
Ronald Reagan did. When Ronald Reagan called the Soviet Union an evil empire, when he stood in front of the Brandenburg Gate and said, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall, those words changed the course of history. The United States has a responsibility to defend our values.
I worked with President Reagan.
My first vote for president was in 1980 for Ronald Reagan. I watched Reagan. I watched every speech that was on TV. I watched every press conference. And I just studied him, and I've read every book that's ever been written about Reagan.
Ronald Reagan is one of the greatest presidents of all time, and certainly of my lifetime.
For America. He loved America. He feared where the left, based on history, wanted to take the country. Ronald Reagan set the stage for the end of the Cold War. Ronald Reagan defeated Soviet communism without firing a shot. I don't know, but none of that would matter.
You vote. There is no other choice for you in this campaign than Ted Cruz, because you are exactly, this is the closest in our lifetimes we have ever been to Ronald Reagan.
I look forward to the day when we have a fighter like Trump who is otherwise more like Reagan in demeanor.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you to the Reagan Library, which is obviously an unbelievably inspiring place to launch my new book, and just an inspiring place to be generally the greatest president of my lifetime, although I was 4 years old when he left. It is amazing to be here. John was generous enough to be pushing for an event here for a long time, and it's fantastic to be at the home of Ronald Reagan, the president who reminded us that tyranny is no more than one generation away if we don't stand up for the truth, and if we do not stand up for that which is righteous and free.
Important that we remember Ronald Reagan, who was not only the greatest president in our lifetime, but he defeated the Soviet Union. He brought America back on a track of prosperity.
My book, Killing Reagan, I think I discovered the secret to Ronald Reagan's success as president, and that is courage.
That drove his advisors crazy. He effected tax cuts and deregulation at home and strength abroad, and he restored America's leadership in the world after a disastrous Democrat administration.
Something, because I'm a pretty big fan of, killing communism with Ronald Reagan.
Mythologizing Ronald Reagan does the country no good at all. He was a man.
But Ronald Reagan's been dead a while, right? And he certainly hasn't been president in decades, but they can't let him go. Why? Because he's the only Republican president that has any semblance of popularity in anyone's lifetime that's still alive today. Nixon, impeach, ran out of the office, I gotta get out of here, resigned in disgrace, right? And then George W. Bush, a laughingstock, not just all over the world, but in this country. George H.W. Bush, they don't like him in his own party. So Reagan. So let's talk about the real
project. After he died, a bunch of very wealthy people got together and put a bunch of money into this. Literally, this project was called the Reagan Legacy Project. And they set out to erect a statue or name a building or a street after Ronald Reagan in every single congressional district in the United States and in every country around the world that essentially does business with the United States. And I think they accomplished their goal as of like 8 years ago.
Concerted effort by billionaires and their wholly owned top GOP operatives to rewrite history and elevate Ronald Reagan's presidency. And sadly, it's working. Our nation's history of great presidents, from George Washington to Thomas Jefferson to Abraham Lincoln to Franklin Delano Roosevelt to John F. Kennedy, all of them overshadowed by one man who tragically began the destruction of America's middle class and dismantled America's greatness, Ronald Reagan. It's time we let the man's resume speak for itself. Reagan wasn't the greatest gift to America. He was just the greatest gift to America's billionaires.
All involved. So is the very structure of our societies. In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. We must never let the weight of this combination endanger our liberties or democratic processes.
Cooperative, bipartisan manner. The Foreign Relations Committees of the Senate and the House were taken into the full confidence of the President in every one of these moves. And don't let anybody tell you anything else. As I've said time and time again, foreign policy should be the policy of the whole nation and not a policy of one party or the other. Partisanship should stop at the water's edge. And
in the billionaire class. They do not like me today. They will like me even less if I'm elected for president. But I welcome their dislike.
History, have these forces been so united against one candidate as they stand today? They are unanimous in their hate for me, and I welcome their hatred.
Franklin Delano Roosevelt in the 1940s said something that we need to keep saying. Is that we need economic rights, not just political rights.
21st century New Deal that we need.
John said it better than I. Healthcare is a human right.
Behind every country, pretty nearly in Europe, in this matter of medical care for our citizens. And then those who say that this should be left to private effort. In those hospitals in New Jersey where the doctors said they wouldn't treat anyone, who paid their hospital bills through Social Security, those hospitals and every other new hospital, the American people, all of us, contribute 1/2, 1 or 2/3 for every new hospital, the national government. We pay 55% of all the research done. We help young men become doctors.